Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently turn back the pages of time to ancient Rome. Tonight, our story takes us deep into the marble halls and shadowed corridors of imperial power, where ambition and madness dance together in a deadly waltz that would forever change the course of Western civilization. Whether you're drifting off or simply looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here with me on this journey through one of history's most fascinating and tragic tales. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. Tonight, we begin the extraordinary saga of Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus and the spectacular collapse of Rome's first imperial dynasty. This isn't some fictional drama from Hollywood. This was reality in the corridors of the Palatine Hill, where absolute power and human nature collided in ways that would echo through history for millennia. Have you ever wondered how an empire that seemed invincible could crumble from within? How a dynasty that had conquered the known world could destroy itself through a toxic combination of paranoia, excess, and blood? The answer lies in the marble chambers, where emperors lived like gods, while slowly losing their humanity. What I'm about to reveal will transport you into a world where senators trembled at a single glance, where mothers poisoned their own sons for power, and where the line between genius and madness blurred beyond recognition. Today, I'm going to take you inside the daily life of Emperor Nero and the Julio-Claudian court. You'll walk through the same rooms where history's most powerful figures plotted against each other. You'll witness the morning routines of an emperor who believed himself divine. You'll experience the suffocating atmosphere of constant surveillance and betrayal that poisoned every relationship within the imperial family. By the end of this series, you'll understand exactly how the greatest empire in human history nearly destroyed itself from within. But before we enter the perfumed halls where Nero held court, let me paint you the scene of Rome in the year 54 CE. The city sprawled across 7 hills like a magnificent beast, its marble temples gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. Over 1 million souls called this place home, making it the largest city the world had ever seen. The Forum Romanum bustled with merchants from Britain to India, their exotic goods creating a symphony of colours and scents that assaulted the senses. Aqueducts carried fresh mountain water into every district, while public baths offered respite from the crushing heat of summer days. Yet beneath this glittering surface lay a world of shadows and whispers. In the narrow streets of the Subura, Rome's poorest citizens crowded into crumbling apartment buildings that rose 6 stories high. These insulae were death traps waiting to collapse or burst into flames, claiming hundreds of lives in moments. The contrast between wealth and poverty was so stark that a single street might separate palatial villas from hovels, where families survived on bread and olive oil. This was the Rome that 17-year-old Nero inherited when his stepfather Claudius died under mysterious circumstances on October 13th, 54 CE. The young man who would become history's most infamous emperor awoke that morning in the house of Livia, nestled on the Palatine Hill among the sprawling complex of imperial residences. His bedchamber was a marvel of luxury that would have impressed pharaohs and kings. Frescoes depicting scenes from Greek mythology covered walls of polished marble, while silk curtains from distant China filtered the morning light into gentle amber streams. Nero's daily routine began before dawn, with the soft footsteps of his personal slaves entering the imperial chambers. These weren't ordinary servants, but highly educated Greeks and freedmen who had been carefully selected for their discretion and loyalty. They moved through the room with practiced silence, preparing heated water for washing, selecting garments appropriate for the day's activities, and arranging the various cosmetics and perfumes that no Roman aristocrat would appear without. The young emperor's morning ablutions were an elaborate ritual that could take over an hour to complete. Slave girls skilled in the art of grooming would carefully oil his skin with precious unguents imported from Arabia and India. His hair, which he wore longer than traditional Roman fashion dictated, was meticulously styled with heated bronze tools and held in place with scented waxes. A light application of cosmetics enhanced his features, while his nails were cleaned and buffed to a shine that reflected his divine status. As Nero prepared for his day, the palace around him hummed with activity that never ceased. In the kitchens far below, dozens of cooks and food tasters worked to prepare meals worthy of the gods. Every dish that would touch the emperor's lips was tested multiple times for poison, a grim reminder that death lurked behind every friendly smile and respectful bow. The imperial food tasters were often slaves who had committed minor offences, their lives deemed expendable in service of protecting their divine master. The emperor's breakfast was a modest affair by palace standards, though it would have fed a dozen ordinary Roman families. Fresh bread still warm from the ovens was served alongside honey from Mount Hymettus, eggs from sacred geese, and exotic fruits that had travelled thousands of miles to grace the imperial table. Wine, diluted with water according to proper Roman custom, accompanied the meal in cups crafted from precious metals and adorned with gems that caught the morning light like captured stars. While Nero dined, his advisors and courtiers gathered in the antechambers, each hoping to secure a precious moment of the emperor's attention. The morning audience was a carefully choreographed dance of power and influence, where the slightest gesture or word could elevate a man to the heights of fortune or condemn him to exile or death. Senators who had governed provinces and commanded legions waited like schoolboys for permission to approach their teenage ruler. The palace hierarchy was as complex and rigid as the laws that governed the empire itself. At the pinnacle stood Nero, answerable only to the gods. Directly beneath him were his closest advisors, men like Seneca, the philosopher, and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, who had guided his education and now attempted to channel his impulses toward responsible governance. These men understood that their own survival depended entirely on maintaining the emperor's favor while somehow moderating his increasingly erratic behavior. Below the inner circle came a carefully ordered procession of officials, each with specific duties and privileges that marked their place in the imperial hierarchy. The chamberlain controlled access to the emperor's presence, wielding power that kings might envy. The secretary handled correspondence that could reshape the fate of nations. The treasurer managed resources that dwarfed the wealth of entire kingdoms. Each position carried enormous responsibility and equally enormous risk, for failure or the mere suspicion of disloyalty could result in swift and brutal punishment. As the morning progressed, Nero would receive reports from across his vast dominion. Scrolls arrived daily from Britain, where Roman legions continued their conquest of Celtic tribes. Dispatches from Germany detailed the constant vigilance required to keep barbarian hordes at bay. News from Egypt described the harvest that would feed Rome's hungry masses. Each report required the emperor's attention and decision, choices that would affect millions of lives he would never see. The weight of such responsibility might have crushed an ordinary man, but Nero had been raised to believe himself divinely chosen for this role. From his earliest childhood, he had been told that the blood of Augustus flowed in his veins, that he was destined to rule not merely as a man, but as a living god. This belief shaped every aspect of his daily existence, from the reverence with which servants approached him to the elaborate ceremonies that marked his public appearances. Yet beneath the marble facades and golden decorations, the imperial palace was a place of constant fear and suspicion. Every conversation might be overheard and reported. Every friendship could be a potential source of betrayal. Every family member represented both an ally and a threat to be carefully managed. Nero had learned these harsh lessons early, watching as his mother Agrippina maneuvered through the treacherous waters of imperial politics with ruthless efficiency. Agrippina the Younger was perhaps the most formidable woman in Roman history, a descendant of Augustus, who had clawed her way to power through marriages, murders, and manipulations, that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. She had secured Nero's adoption by Emperor Claudius, eliminated rivals through poison and political maneuvering, and positioned herself as the true power behind the imperial throne. Her presence loomed over every aspect of her son's daily routine, a constant reminder that even emperors were not free from family obligations and maternal expectations. The relationship between Nero and his mother was complex beyond modern understanding, mixing genuine affection with political calculation and psychological manipulation. Each morning's interactions between them were carefully observed by the entire court, as shifts in their dynamic could signal major changes in imperial policy. When Agrippina smiled, ambitious courtiers breathed easier. When she frowned, smart men began making contingency plans for their survival. As Nero moved through his morning routine, slaves and servants anticipated his every need with an efficiency born of terror and practice. His personal guard, hand-picked Germans whose loyalty was assured through generous pay and the promise of Roman citizenship, shadowed his every movement. These men understood that their own lives depended on the emperor's safety, creating a bubble of protection that isolated him from the common experiences of ordinary mortality. The emperor's clothing was itself a statement of divine authority. Purple silk, a colour reserved for imperial use alone, adorned his body in carefully draped folds that had been arranged by experts in the art of imperial presentation. Golden threads wove through the fabric in patterns that told the story of Roman conquest and divine favour. Jewels from every corner of the known world caught the light with each movement, creating an almost supernatural aura around the young ruler. This elaborate presentation served multiple purposes beyond mere vanity. In a world where few could read and communication travelled slowly, visual symbols carried enormous weight in establishing and maintaining authority. Every citizen who glimpsed the emperor needed to understand immediately that they stood in the presence of divine power. The clothing, jewellery, and ceremonial objects that surrounded Nero were carefully calculated to inspire awe, fear, and unquestioning obedience in all who beheld them. The morning audiences that followed breakfast were perhaps the most crucial hours of each imperial day. Here, in chambers decorated with the spoils of conquest and the artistry of master craftsmen, the business of governing the world's greatest empire unfolded through a series of carefully orchestrated meetings and presentations. Senators arrived bearing proposals for new laws. Provincial governors sought approval for major projects. Military commanders requested reinforcements for distant campaigns, and foreign ambassadors presented tribute from client kingdoms. Each audience was a performance in which every participant played a carefully defined role. Petitioners approached the imperial throne with prescribed gestures of submission and respect. They spoke in formulaic phrases designed to acknowledge the emperor's divine status while presenting their requests in terms that emphasized service to the state rather than personal ambition. The emperor, in turn, was expected to respond with wisdom that reflected his connection to the gods and his concern for the welfare of his subjects. But beneath this ceremonial veneer, the real business of empire proceeded through whispered conversations, subtle gestures, and unspoken understandings that could reshape the fate of nations. A slight nod might approve the execution of a troublesome senator. A raised eyebrow could launch military campaigns that would cost thousands of lives. A casual comment about provincial administration might trigger political purges that would echo through generations. The delicate balance of power that governed these morning audiences reflected the complex web of relationships that held the empire together. Nero's advisors had carefully structured these sessions to manage the flow of information and influence that reached the young emperor's ears. Seneca, his former tutor and now chief counselor, stood always within whispering distance, ready to provide guidance when the weight of decision-making threatened to overwhelm his inexperienced charge. These whispered consultations were themselves a form of theatre, observed and interpreted by every person present in the audience chamber. When Seneca leaned close to speak privately with Nero, ambitious courtiers strained to read their body language and facial expressions for clues about imperial favor and future policy directions. A smile shared between emperor and advisor might signal approval for a particular faction's agenda, while a frown could doom carefully laid plans and political alliances. The physical arrangement of the audience chamber reinforced these power dynamics through every architectural detail. The imperial throne, carved from a single block of precious porphyry and elevated on a platform of white marble steps, dominated the space like an altar to divine authority. Petitioners approached across an expanse of polished floor that forced them to walk slowly and deliberately, their footsteps echoing in the vast space as a reminder of their vulnerability and the emperor's power to grant life or death with a single word. Columns of rare marble from quarries across the Mediterranean supported a ceiling decorated with gold leaf that caught and reflected the light from dozens of oil lamps and braziers. The effect was to create an atmosphere that seemed almost otherworldly, as if the audience chamber existed in some realm between earth and heaven, where mortal concerns intersected with divine will. This carefully crafted environment was designed to reinforce the psychological impact of imperial authority on everyone who entered its sacred precincts. As the morning audiences progressed, Nero gradually revealed the personality traits that would define his reign and ultimately doom his dynasty. His responses to various petitions and reports showed flashes of genuine intelligence, mixed with disturbing signs of cruelty and self-indulgence. When a provincial governor reported success in suppressing local rebellions, the emperor's face lit up with genuine pleasure at hearing of Roman victories. But when another official mentioned the need for increased taxation to fund military campaigns, Nero's expression darkened with the petulant anger of a child denied a desired toy. These mood swings were carefully observed by everyone present, as the emperor's emotional state could have far-reaching consequences for imperial policy and individual survival. Courtiers learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether their ruler was in a receptive mood for new proposals, or whether discretion suggested postponing sensitive matters for another day. A slight tightening around Nero's eyes might signal growing impatience with lengthy presentations, while a drumming of his fingers on the throne's armrest warned that his attention was wandering toward more entertaining diversions. The entertainment that increasingly captured Nero's attention was already becoming a source of concern for his advisors and the broader Roman establishment. Even during these formal morning audiences, the emperor's thoughts often drifted toward the artistic pursuits that he found far more engaging than the mundane business of governance. His eyes would brighten when discussing plans for new theatrical productions or architectural projects, showing an enthusiasm that was notably absent during discussions of taxation, military logistics, or provincial administration. This growing obsession with artistic expression manifested itself in subtle ways throughout the daily routine of imperial life. Musicians and poets found themselves granted audiences more readily than experienced administrators. Architects presenting designs for lavish entertainment venues received more attention than engineers proposing practical improvements to infrastructure. The emperor's personal quarters gradually filled with musical instruments, theatrical masks, and artistic implements that spoke to interests far removed from the traditional pursuits of Roman rulers. The afternoon hours brought a shift in the palace atmosphere as the formal business of morning gave way to the more relaxed rhythms of imperial leisure. Nero would often retreat to private gardens where he could indulge his artistic interests away from the scrutinizing eyes of senators and administrators. These garden retreats were themselves marvels of engineering and artistry, featuring elaborate water features, exotic plants from every corner of the empire, and secluded pavilions where the emperor could practice his music and poetry without fear of political judgment. In these private moments, servants observed behaviors that would have scandalized traditional Roman sensibilities, but which Nero increasingly viewed as expressions of his divine nature and artistic genius. He would spend hours practicing the lyre, an instrument associated more with Greek culture than Roman military tradition. His voice training sessions, conducted under the guidance of professional musicians, imported from Alexandria and Athens, revealed an obsession with public performance that horrified advisors who understood the implications for imperial dignity. The emperor's fascination with Greek culture extended far beyond music and poetry into areas that challenged fundamental Roman values about masculinity, authority, and proper conduct for members of the ruling class. He experimented with elaborate hairstyles that required hours of daily maintenance and cosmetic applications that would have been considered appropriate only for women or actors. His clothing choices increasingly favored flowing fabrics and bright colors that emphasized artistic sensibility over military bearing. These personal indulgences might have remained private eccentricities, but Nero's position made every aspect of his behavior a matter of public significance and political consequence. Slaves and servants who witnessed his daily routines carried gossip throughout the palace complex, where it was analyzed and interpreted by courtiers seeking to understand and potentially exploit the emperor's changing priorities. What began as whispered observations about unusual personal habits gradually evolved into serious discussions about the implications of having a ruler whose interests lay so far outside traditional Roman expectations. The evening hours brought their own rituals and challenges as the imperial court transitioned from the business of governance to the elaborate social ceremonies that reinforced hierarchical relationships and political alliances. Dinner parties in the imperial dining rooms were carefully choreographed events where every detail of seating arrangement, menu selection, and conversational topics reflected the complex web of favor and influence that determined individual fates within the palace hierarchy. These evening gatherings provided opportunities for informal diplomacy and relationship building that were often more important than the formal morning audiences in shaping imperial policy. Over courses of delicacies imported from across the known world, deals were struck, alliances were formed, and enemies were identified through subtle verbal exchanges and meaningful glances. The emperor's behavior during these social occasions was scrutinized for signs of favor or displeasure that could elevate or destroy political careers overnight. Nero's increasing preference for surrounding himself with artists, musicians, and theatrical performers during these evening entertainments sent clear signals about his evolving priorities and interests. Traditional senators and military commanders found themselves seated at less prestigious positions, while Greek intellectuals and professional entertainers enjoyed places of honor near the imperial couch. This gradual shift in social arrangements reflected deeper changes in imperial values that would have profound consequences for the stability of Roman governance. The physical layout of these dining spaces reinforced the theatrical nature of imperial social life through architectural features designed to create dramatic effects and emphasize the emperor's central role in all proceedings. Elaborate mechanical devices could change the room's appearance during the course of a meal, with ceiling panels opening to release flower petals or reveal painted scenes from mythology. Hidden musicians provided soundtrack accompaniment to conversations, while professional performers entertained guests with displays of skill that blurred the boundaries between reality and artistic presentation. As night fell over the 7 hills of Rome, the palace complex took on an entirely different character that revealed aspects of imperial life hidden during daylight hours. Torches and oil lamps created pools of flickering light that left vast areas in shadow, perfect for the clandestine meetings and secret communications that were essential elements of court intrigue. In these darkened corridors, messages were passed between rival factions, romantic liaisons were arranged and discovered, and the real business of survival in the imperial household proceeded through whispered conversations and careful alliances. The emperor's private evening routine revealed the psychological pressures and personal insecurities that lay beneath the confident facade he maintained during public appearances. Alone in his chambers with only his most trusted servants, Nero often displayed signs of the anxiety and paranoia that would increasingly characterize his reign. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares that reflected the constant awareness of danger that surrounded anyone who held absolute power in a world where assassination was always a possibility, and family members could never be completely trusted. Even in sleep, the emperor was never truly alone or unguarded. Trusted bodyguards maintained constant vigil outside his chambers, while food tasters remained on duty throughout the night in case imperial hunger required satisfaction. The bedroom itself was equipped with hidden passages and escape routes that could be activated at a moment's notice if palace security was compromised. Every precaution that paranoid minds could devise had been implemented to protect the life that held the entire imperial system together. The morning would bring another cycle of the same elaborate routines, but each day brought subtle changes that reflected the gradual transformation of both the emperor and the empire he ruled. Nero's artistic interests were evolving from private hobbies into public obsessions that would eventually dominate imperial policy and scandalize Roman society. The seeds of conflict between traditional Roman values and the emperor's personal vision were already germinating in the daily interactions between ruler and ruled that defined life within the palace walls. These seemingly innocent changes in daily routine and personal preference would ultimately contribute to a cascade of events that would bring down not just Nero himself, but the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since the time of Augustus. The teenage emperor who practiced his lyre in garden pavilions and experimented with Greek fashions was unconsciously setting in motion forces that would reshape the Roman world and echo through history for millennia to come. The transformation was already visible to those who knew how to read the signs. By the winter of 54 CE, barely months into his reign, Nero's daily schedule had begun to shift in ways that would have alarmed Augustus himself. Where previous emperors rose with the sun to attend to military dispatches and provincial reports, Nero increasingly delayed his morning audiences to accommodate longer sessions with his Greek tutors in rhetoric and music theory. The palace slaves noticed it first, as servants always do. The emperor's wake-up call moved from the traditional pre-dawn hour to mid-morning, then later still as his evening entertainment stretched deeper into the night. His personal attendants learned to tread even more softly as they prepared his chambers. For the young ruler's temper had grown shorter with each passing week, and the consequences of disturbing his rest could be severe. What concerned his advisors most was not the emperor's changing sleep patterns, but the company he kept during his waking hours. The morning councils that had once focused on reports from provincial governors and military commanders increasingly included discussions about theatrical productions and architectural projects that served no practical purpose for imperial administration. When Seneca attempted to redirect conversations toward pressing matters of state, he often found himself competing with a Greek musician or a Syrian dance instructor for the emperor's attention. The physical changes in Nero himself were equally troubling to those who remembered the promising young man who had first assumed the purple. His body, once trim from regular exercise in the Campus Martius, had begun to soften as he spent more time reclining during extended musical practice sessions and elaborate banquets. His face, still handsome by any measure, carried new lines of petulance around the eyes and mouth that appeared whenever he was denied some desired indulgence or forced to attend to tedious administrative duties. More disturbing than these physical alterations was the gradual change in Nero's relationship with his mother. Agrippina had orchestrated his rise to power with the expectation that she would continue to guide imperial policy through maternal influence and political manipulation. But as Nero grew more confident in his divine authority and more absorbed in his artistic pursuits, he began to chafe under her constant supervision and increasingly blunt criticism of his behavior. The morning ritual of greeting his mother had once been a highlight of Nero's daily routine, a chance to discuss policy and receive the political wisdom that had elevated their family to supreme power. Now these meetings had become tense affairs where Agrippina's disapproval of her son's changing priorities created an atmosphere of barely controlled hostility. She would arrive at his chambers with lists of pressing matters requiring imperial attention, only to find him distracted by a new composition he was working on or excited about plans for a theatrical performance he intended to stage. These confrontations between mother and son provided endless entertainment for the palace gossips, who made their living by observing and reporting on the subtle dynamics of imperial family relationships. Every gesture was analysed for signs of shifting power balances. When Agrippina left her son's presence with tight lips and rigid posture, word spread quickly through the servant networks that another family crisis was brewing. When Nero dismissed her concerns with a casual wave of his hand, courtiers began calculating how this display of independence might affect their own positions and allegiances. The emperor's daily routine now included lengthy consultations with a growing circle of artistic advisors who had no background in governance but possessed the musical and theatrical knowledge that increasingly dominated his interests. These men, many of them freedmen of Greek or Eastern origin, found themselves wielding influence that traditional Roman aristocrats could only envy and resent. A casual comment from one of these cultural advisors about the acoustic properties of a proposed theatre could carry more weight in imperial decision-making than carefully researched reports from experienced provincial administrators. Nero's obsession with performance extended beyond private practice sessions to encompass every aspect of his public appearances. He began to view his daily audiences and ceremonial obligations as opportunities to perfect his stagecraft and oratorical skills. The traditional formulas of imperial address were modified to include more dramatic gestures and vocal techniques borrowed from professional actors. Senate meetings became exercises in theatrical presentation, where the emperor's delivery of routine business was carefully crafted to maximize emotional impact on his audience. This transformation of governance into entertainment horrified senators and administrators who understood that effective imperial rule required attention to practical details rather than artistic flourishes. When provincial governors reported serious problems requiring immediate imperial attention, they found themselves competing with elaborate dinner parties and musical performances for access to their ruler. Emergency dispatches from frontier commanders might wait days for imperial review, while Nero perfected a particularly challenging passage on his lyre. The emperor's sleeping quarters reflected his evolving interests through decorative changes that emphasized artistic themes over traditional Roman martial imagery. Where previous rulers had surrounded themselves with weapons, military standards, and portraits of victorious ancestors, Nero's private chambers increasingly featured musical instruments, theatrical masks, and sculptures depicting scenes from Greek mythology. The traditional symbols of Roman power were gradually replaced by objects that celebrated creativity and aesthetic achievement. His daily wardrobe choices became another source of concern for advisors who understood the political significance of imperial appearance. The purple-striped toga that symbolized Roman authority gave way to more elaborate garments that emphasized artistic sensibility over military bearing. Flowing silk robes imported from China, jewelry designed by craftsmen from Alexandria, and hairstyles that required hours of daily maintenance by skilled cosmeticians created an imperial image that challenged traditional expectations about masculine Roman leadership. The morning ritual of receiving foreign ambassadors provided particularly striking examples of how Nero's changing priorities affected imperial diplomacy. Envoys who had traveled thousands of miles to present important treaties or tribute arrangements found themselves waiting while the emperor completed music lessons or poetry recitations. When audiences were finally granted, discussions of trade agreements and military alliances competed with the emperor's desire to demonstrate his artistic accomplishments to these distinguished foreign visitors. The reaction of these diplomatic representatives to Nero's unconventional behavior created ripple effects throughout the Mediterranean world, as reports reached foreign courts about the Roman emperor's strange obsessions and priorities. Client kings and tribal leaders, who had once feared Roman military, might begin to question whether the empire's leadership possessed the focus and determination necessary to maintain the complex system of alliances and threats that kept the provinces peaceful and productive. Within the palace walls, the emperor's daily routine created new hierarchies and power structures that bypassed traditional channels of authority and influence. Musicians and artists who had once been considered mere entertainers found themselves consulted on matters of state policy. when their areas of expertise intersected with imperial interests. A theatre architect might influence decisions about urban planning in Rome, while a professional musician could affect appointments to positions in provinces where cultural development was considered important. These informal advisory relationships created opportunities for corruption and manipulation that experienced courtiers were quick to exploit. Men who understood how to present practical proposals in artistic terms gained access to imperial attention that was denied to more traditional administrators. A request for increased taxation might be rejected if presented as a fiscal necessity, but approved if framed as funding for cultural projects that would demonstrate Roman sophistication and divine imperial favour. The afternoon hours of Nero's daily schedule increasingly revolved around rehearsals and practice sessions that prepared him for public performances he was planning to give, despite the horror of his advisors. Traditional Roman values held that respectable men did not perform publicly for entertainment, as such activities were associated with slaves and social outcasts who had no choice but to debase themselves for survival. But Nero viewed these restrictions as obstacles to his artistic development and divine self-expression. His practice sessions were elaborate affairs that required the participation of professional musicians, voice coaches, and dramatic instructors who had been imported from the cultural centres of the Greek world. These daily rehearsals were conducted with the same intensity and attention to detail that previous emperors had devoted to military planning and administrative oversight. Every aspect of vocal technique, instrumental performance, and stage presence was analysed and perfected through repetition and professional guidance. The emperor's growing confidence in his artistic abilities led to increasingly bold plans for public performance that sent waves of anxiety through the Roman establishment. Rumours circulated about proposed appearances in public theatres where Nero would compete directly with professional entertainers for audience approval. The prospect of their divine ruler subjecting himself to the judgment of common citizens, who might boo or hiss if his performance disappointed them, struck traditional Romans as a violation of fundamental principles about imperial dignity and social hierarchy. As evening approached each day, Nero's transformation from traditional Roman ruler to aspiring artist became most apparent in the elaborate dinner parties he hosted for fellow enthusiasts of Greek culture and artistic expression. These gatherings bore little resemblance to the formal state dinners that had characterized previous imperial entertaining. Instead of discussions about military campaigns and provincial administration, conversation focused on aesthetic theory, musical innovation, and dramatic interpretation of classical texts. The guest lists for these evening entertainments reflected the emperor's changing values and priorities. Greek intellectuals, professional performers, and cultural critics occupied places of honor that had once been reserved for senators, military commanders, and provincial governors. Traditional Roman aristocrats found themselves relegated to less prestigious seating, while foreign artists and freedmen enjoyed intimate access to imperial conversation and favour. These social arrangements sent clear messages about the direction of imperial policy and the types of individuals who could expect advancement under Nero's rule. Young men from aristocratic families began to reconsider their traditional education in rhetoric and law, recognizing that musical training and artistic accomplishment might provide better paths to imperial favour and career advancement. The very foundations of Roman social mobility were shifting as merit came to be defined in terms of cultural sophistication rather than military achievement or administrative competence. The evening's entertainment often featured performances by the emperor himself, as Nero used these private gatherings to test new material and receive feedback from audiences he considered qualified to appreciate his artistic development. These performances were command appearances in the truest sense, as guests understood that their continued access to imperial favour depended partly on their ability to provide enthusiastic and constructive responses to their hosts' creative efforts. The psychological pressure created by these expectations affected every aspect of social interaction within the imperial court. Courtiers learned to school their expressions and moderate their responses to ensure that genuine reactions of surprise or disappointment could not be misinterpreted as criticism of imperial artistic ability. A poorly timed cough during one of Nero's musical performances could be interpreted as deliberate disruption, while insufficient enthusiasm for his poetic recitations might suggest dangerous lack of appreciation for divine creativity. As the night deepened and wine flowed more freely, these artistic gatherings often evolved into more adventurous entertainments that pushed the boundaries of traditional Roman morality and social convention. The emperor's fascination with Greek culture extended to aspects of Hellenic lifestyle that conservative Romans found deeply troubling, including attitudes towards sexuality, religious practice, and social hierarchy that challenged fundamental assumptions about proper conduct and imperial dignity. The servants and slaves who attended these evening entertainments witnessed behaviors that would have been scandalous if they had occurred in any other household, but which took on different meanings when performed by someone who believed himself to be a living god. The line between artistic expression and moral transgression became increasingly blurred as Nero explored the full range of experiences he believed necessary for his cultural development and creative inspiration. When the emperor finally retired to his private chambers in the early hours of morning, he carried with him the euphoria and exhaustion of someone who had spent the evening living completely according to his own desires and artistic vision. The weight of imperial responsibility, the expectations of traditional Roman society, and the practical demands of governing a vast empire seemed remote and unimportant compared to the immediate satisfaction of creative self-expression and aesthetic achievement. But even in these moments of artistic triumph, darker currents flowed beneath the surface of imperial consciousness. The same sensitivity that enabled Nero to appreciate subtle musical harmonies and poetic meter also made him acutely aware of criticism and resistance to his evolving vision of imperial leadership. Every whispered conversation that stopped when he approached, every carefully neutral expression during his performances, every diplomatic suggestion from his advisors that he moderate his artistic pursuits, fed a growing paranoia about the loyalty and appreciation of those around him. The emperor's bedtime routine increasingly included consultations with trusted servants and freedmen who could provide unfiltered reports about palace gossip and public reaction to his changing behavior. These midnight conversations revealed an imperial psyche caught between supreme confidence in his divine nature and artistic genius, and nagging doubts about whether others truly understood and appreciated the revolutionary changes he was bringing to Roman culture and governance. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little respite from these psychological tensions. The emperor's dreams were increasingly filled with visions of artistic triumph and public acclamation, mixed with nightmares of rejection and failure that reflected his deep need for validation and approval. The young man who had once found security in the traditional structures of imperial authority was now creating his own standards of success and failure based on aesthetic criteria that few Romans understood or appreciated. Each new dawn brought fresh opportunities to advance his artistic development and cultural revolution, but also new challenges as the gap widened between his personal vision and the expectations of Roman society. The daily routine that had once provided stability and predictability in imperial life was becoming a source of conflict and tension as Nero struggled to balance his roles as political ruler and creative artist. The transformation was accelerating with each passing month, and those who observed it most closely began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in Roman history. An emperor was choosing to redefine the very nature of imperial authority according to principles that had never before been tested in the harsh realities of governing a vast and complex empire. The consequences of this transformation became apparent in the spring of 55 CE, when Nero made a decision that would forever alter his relationship with both his mother and the Roman people. It began, as many momentous changes do, with what seemed like a trivial morning conversation in the imperial gardens. Agrippina had arrived for their daily conference carrying scrolls containing reports from Britain where Roman legions were struggling to maintain control over rebellious Celtic tribes. The situation required immediate attention and significant military reinforcement, but she found her son distracted by a new theatrical mask he had commissioned from a craftsman in Alexandria. The mask, carved from ivory and inlaid with precious stones, depicted Dionysus in a moment of divine ecstasy, and Nero was examining every detail with the intensity that previous emperors had reserved for military maps and strategic planning. When Agrippina attempted to redirect his attention to the British crisis, Nero's response revealed how profoundly his priorities had shifted. He waved dismissively at the military reports while continuing to study the mask's craftsmanship, commenting on the subtle expression the artist had achieved around the eyes and mouth. The rebellion in Britain could wait, he declared, until he had completed preparations for a private theatrical performance he was planning to present to a select audience of cultural enthusiasts. This moment marked the beginning of open warfare between mother and son, a conflict that would consume the imperial household and ultimately reshape the entire structure of Roman governance. Agrippina's carefully controlled fury at her son's casual dismissal of urgent imperial business was witnessed by dozens of servants and courtiers who understood immediately that they were observing a fundamental shift in palace power dynamics. The confrontation that followed revealed aspects of both personalities that had been hidden beneath years of political cooperation and mutual dependence. Agrippina's voice, usually modulated to convey maternal warmth mixed with political authority, rose to levels that could be heard throughout the palace complex as she detailed the catastrophic consequences of ignoring military necessities in favor of artistic pursuits. Her words carried the accumulated frustration of months of watching her son drift away from the responsibilities she had sacrificed everything to place within his grasp. Nero's response was even more shocking than his mother's outburst. Instead of the respectful deference he had always shown to her political wisdom, he displayed a cold imperial authority that she had never seen directed toward herself. His voice remained level and controlled, but his words carried unmistakable menace as he reminded her that he was emperor by divine right, not by maternal appointment, and that his decisions required no justification to anyone, including the woman who had given him birth. The servants who witnessed this exchange scattered throughout the palace complex, carrying news that would fundamentally alter every relationship within the imperial household. The balance of power that had maintained stability since Claudius's death had shifted decisively, and everyone who depended on imperial favor for their survival needed to recalculate their loyalties and allegiances accordingly. In the days following this confrontation, Nero's daily routine underwent changes that reflected his newfound independence from maternal oversight. The morning meetings that had once included Agrippina, as a matter of course, were restructured to exclude her except when specifically invited. The emperor's personal schedule was modified to avoid the regular interactions that had previously given his mother opportunities to influence his decisions and priorities. These changes created a power vacuum within the palace hierarchy that ambitious courtiers were quick to exploit. Men who had previously operated through Agrippina's influence began seeking direct access to the emperor, while others who had been excluded from her inner circle suddenly found new opportunities for advancement. The careful balance of factions and interests that had characterized the early months of Nero's reign gave way to a more chaotic competition for imperial favor and attention. The emperor's artistic advisors, previously relegated to secondary status behind traditional political counselors, found themselves elevated to positions of unprecedented influence. The Greek musician who had once been consulted only about lyre technique was now asked for opinions about architectural projects and urban planning. The Syrian dance instructor whose expertise had been limited to matters of performance and stagecraft was invited to participate in discussions about diplomatic protocol and ceremonial arrangements. This elevation of cultural advisors to positions of political influence created opportunities for corruption and manipulation that more experienced courtiers quickly learned to exploit. Men who understood how to frame practical proposals in artistic terms gained access to imperial decision-making processes that were denied to traditional administrators who lacked cultural sophistication or aesthetic sensibility. The morning audiences that had once focused primarily on military reports and provincial administration were gradually transformed into forums for discussing cultural projects and artistic initiatives. Senators who arrived with carefully prepared presentations about taxation policy and infrastructure maintenance found themselves competing for attention, with architects proposing new theatre designs and musicians suggesting modifications to existing performance venues. Nero's personal involvement in these cultural discussions revealed an intelligence and attention to detail that had been notably absent during previous administrative meetings. When presented with plans for a new amphitheatre, he would spend hours examining architectural drawings and questioning engineers about acoustic properties and sightlines. But when military commanders requested approval for troop deployments or provincial governors sought guidance about local rebellions, his responses were often perfunctory and distracted. The emperor's changing priorities were reflected in the physical modifications being made to the palace complex itself. Traditional reception halls designed to emphasize imperial authority through austere magnificence were redecorated to create more intimate spaces, suitable for artistic performance and cultural discussion. Walls that had once displayed weapons and military standards were covered with theatrical masks and musical instruments that spoke to entirely different values and interests. The imperial bedchamber underwent particularly dramatic changes that reflected Nero's evolving self-image and cultural aspirations. The simple military cot that had served previous emperors was replaced with an elaborate sleeping couch designed according to Greek aesthetic principles. The room's decorations were modified to emphasize themes from classical mythology rather than Roman military history, creating an environment that suggested artistic inspiration rather than martial authority. These physical changes in imperial living spaces were accompanied by modifications to daily routines that further emphasized cultural pursuits over traditional governmental responsibilities. The emperor's morning schedule now included lengthy sessions with Greek tutors who provided instruction in advanced poetic meter and dramatic interpretation. His afternoon hours were increasingly devoted to private rehearsals where he could practice new musical compositions and theatrical pieces away from the critical observation of traditional courtiers. The evening entertainments that had once served primarily diplomatic and political functions were transformed into cultural salons where artistic achievement was celebrated above military valor or administrative competence. Foreign ambassadors who had traveled thousands of miles to present important treaties found themselves attending poetry readings and musical performances that bore no relation to the serious business that had brought them to Rome. These changes in imperial entertaining created diplomatic complications that worried experienced advisors who understood the delicate nature of Roman relationships with client kingdoms and tributary states. When barbarian chieftains accustomed to traditional displays of Roman military might encounter an emperor more interested in discussing Greek drama than frontier defense, their respect for imperial authority was inevitably diminished. The psychological impact of these cultural transformations extended far beyond the palace walls, as news of Nero's evolving interests spread throughout Roman society. Traditional aristocratic families who had built their identities around military service and governmental administration found their fundamental assumptions about leadership and authority challenged by an emperor who seemed to value artistic sensitivity over martial prowess. Young men from prominent families began reconsidering their educational priorities as reports circulated about the types of individuals who were gaining imperial favor and advancement. Traditional training in rhetoric, law, and military tactics seemed less valuable than instruction in music, poetry, and theatrical performance when career advancement depended on appealing to an emperor whose interests lay so far outside conventional Roman expectations. The emperor's personal relationships within his own family reflected these broader cultural tensions, as Nero's siblings and relatives struggled to adapt to his changing priorities and values. Family gatherings that had once focused on political strategy and dynastic planning were increasingly dominated by discussions of artistic projects and cultural events that seemed irrelevant to the practical business of maintaining imperial power. His relationship with his wife Octavia became particularly strained, as she found herself married to a man whose interests and behavior bore little resemblance to traditional Roman masculine ideals. Octavia had been raised with conventional expectations about imperial marriage and the role of an empress in supporting her husband's governmental responsibilities. But Nero's obsession with artistic pursuits and cultural experimentation left little room for the types of partnership and collaboration that had characterized previous imperial marriages. The empress found herself increasingly isolated within the palace hierarchy, as her husband's attention focused on Greek intellectuals and artistic advisors who had no interest in including her in their cultural discussions and creative projects. Her attempts to maintain traditional imperial dignity and propriety seemed hopelessly outdated in an environment where conventional social boundaries were constantly being challenged and redefined. The servants and slaves who maintained the imperial household witnessed the daily tensions and conflicts that these cultural transformations created within the family structure. Whispered conversations in corridors and service areas carried gossip about imperial marital difficulties and family disputes that reflected broader struggles between traditional values and innovative approaches to imperial leadership. As autumn arrived in 55 CE, these accumulated tensions reached a breaking point that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Nero's reign and the fate of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The crisis began with what appeared to be a minor disagreement about guest lists for an upcoming imperial banquet, but quickly escalated into a confrontation that revealed the depth of opposition to Nero's cultural revolution within his own family and closest advisors. Agrippina had prepared a list of distinguished guests whose attendance would demonstrate appropriate respect for traditional Roman values and political relationships. Her selections included senior senators, military commanders, and provincial governors whose presence would reinforce the emperor's connection to established governmental structures and constitutional traditions. Nero's alternative guest list reflected his transformed priorities and cultural interests. Greek philosophers, professional musicians, theatrical performers, and artists from across the Mediterranean were invited to participate in an evening that would celebrate aesthetic achievement rather than political accomplishment. The contrast between these two approaches to imperial entertaining could not have been more stark or symbolically significant. The argument that erupted over these competing visions of appropriate imperial hospitality became a proxy war for larger questions about the direction of Roman civilization and the nature of legitimate authority. Mother and son faced each other across a gulf that represented not merely personal disagreement, but fundamental conflicts about values, priorities, and the proper relationship between power and culture. What had begun as a typical morning conference between emperor and advisor escalated into a shouting match that could be heard throughout the palace complex. Servants pressed against doors and walls to catch fragments of conversation that would provide clues about shifting power relationships and future opportunities for advancement or survival. The confrontation revealed aspects of both personalities that had been carefully concealed beneath years of political cooperation and mutual dependence. Agrippina's controlled facade cracked to reveal the ruthless ambition and fierce maternal protectiveness that had driven her to eliminate rivals and manipulate imperial succession. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, but also the desperation of a woman who sensed her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. Nero's response demonstrated that the artistic sensitivity he had been cultivating had not diminished his capacity for cruelty or his understanding of power dynamics. His words were chosen with the precision of a professional poet, but their content was designed to wound and humiliate rather than merely to disagree or correct. He reminded his mother that her influence depended entirely on his tolerance, and that this tolerance could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. The immediate aftermath of this confrontation sent shockwaves throughout the imperial administration, as courtiers and officials attempted to understand the implications for their own positions and future prospects. Men who had built their careers on Agrippina's patronage began making discreet inquiries about alternative sources of protection and advancement. Others who had been excluded from her inner circle saw opportunities to gain access to imperial favor through direct appeals to the emperor's artistic interests. The palace atmosphere in the days following this family crisis was charged with tension and uncertainty, as everyone waited to see how the new power structure would stabilize and what consequences would flow from the fundamental realignment of imperial relationships. Servants moved more quietly through corridor and chambers, understanding that their survival might depend on their ability to avoid becoming inadvertent witnesses to sensitive conversations or private moments of imperial vulnerability. Nero's daily routine continued, but with subtle modifications that reflected his enhanced independence and growing confidence in his own judgment about cultural and political matters. The morning audiences that had once required maternal approval and oversight were now conducted according to his personal preferences and priorities. The afternoon rehearsals and evening entertainments that she had previously criticized as inappropriate distractions from imperial responsibility were expanded and elaborated without regard for traditional objections or conservative sensibilities. The emperor's sleeping patterns, already irregular due to his late-night artistic activities, became even more erratic as he struggled with the psychological aftermath of severing the maternal relationship that had provided stability and guidance throughout his youth. The man who had learned to view himself as divine and infallible during public appearances found himself plagued by private doubts and anxieties that reflected the enormous pressures of absolute authority, combined with social isolation. His dreams during this period were haunted by visions that mixed artistic triumph with family betrayal, public acclamation with private loneliness. The psychological cost of rejecting maternal guidance while embracing unprecedented cultural experimentation created internal conflicts that would influence every subsequent decision and relationship throughout his reign. The transformation was irreversible now, accelerating toward a destiny that neither mother nor son could have fully anticipated when they first began their climb toward ultimate power. The teenage emperor, who had once practiced his lyre in secret, was preparing to remake Roman civilization according to his personal vision of artistic excellence and cultural sophistication, regardless of the cost to traditional values, family relationships, or imperial stability. The winter months brought a profound shift in the very fabric of imperial life, as Nero's artistic obsessions began to consume not just his personal hours, but the entire machinery of Roman government. By early 56 CE, the palace had become something unprecedented in Roman history. A hybrid of governmental center and artistic academy, where the business of ruling the world competed daily with rehearsals, recitals, and elaborate cultural experiments. The emperor's morning routine now began with vocal exercises conducted in a specially constructed chamber designed to optimize acoustic properties for musical practice. Professional voice coaches from Alexandria and Athens had taken up permanent residence in the palace, their daily sessions with Nero taking precedence over military briefings and administrative reports. These men, many of them former slaves who had earned their freedom through exceptional artistic talent, found themselves wielding influence that seasoned senators could only envy. The transformation of the imperial schedule created cascading effects throughout the Roman administrative system. Provincial governors accustomed to receiving prompt responses to urgent dispatches found their communications delayed while the emperor perfected his interpretation of tragic monologues from Greek drama. Military commanders requesting reinforcements for frontier campaigns discovered that their strategic assessments were reviewed only after Nero completed his daily lyre practice and poetry composition sessions. This reordering of imperial priorities was most apparent during the morning audiences that had traditionally served as the primary mechanism for governing the empire's vast territories and diverse populations. Where Augustus had processed dozens of administrative matters with military efficiency, Nero's attention wandered constantly toward aesthetic considerations that seemed irrelevant to practical governance. A report about grain shortages in Egypt might trigger a lengthy discussion about the rhythmic patterns in harvest songs, while urgent news of barbarian incursions prompted questions about whether battlefield descriptions could be adapted for dramatic performance. The physical environment of these governmental meetings reflected the emperor's evolving interests through decorative modifications that would have scandalized earlier rulers. The austere magnificence that had characterized imperial reception halls gave way to more theatrical arrangements, featuring elaborate draperies, strategically placed mirrors to enhance acoustic effects, and hidden alcoves where musicians could provide atmospheric accompaniment to routine administrative proceedings. Senators arriving for these audiences found themselves navigating an entirely new protocol that emphasized cultural sophistication over traditional political credentials. Knowledge of Greek poetic meter could prove more valuable than expertise in military logistics, while the ability to discuss theatrical theory might open doors that remained closed to men with decades of provincial administrative experience. The careful hierarchies that had governed Roman political advancement for generations were being quietly revolutionized according to aesthetic criteria that few traditional aristocrats understood or appreciated. The emperor's personal appearance during these morning sessions revealed the extent to which his self-image had diverged from conventional expectations about imperial dignity and masculine authority. His clothing, while still technically appropriate for his divine status, incorporated elements borrowed from Greek and Eastern traditions that emphasized artistic sensibility over martial bearing. Flowing fabrics that moved gracefully during oratorical gestures replaced the rigid formal togas that had symbolized Roman gravitas. Jewelry selected for its artistic merit rather than traditional symbolism created visual effects that suggested creative inspiration rather than military conquest. His grooming routine had evolved into an elaborate daily ritual that required the services of cosmetic specialists imported from across the Mediterranean. These artists, skilled in techniques developed for theatrical performance, enhanced Nero's natural features through subtle applications of pigments and preparations that would have been considered appropriate only for actors or women in traditional Roman society. The emperor's hair, grown longer than conventional masculine fashion dictated, was styled with heated implements and scented preparations that created effects impossible to achieve through simple barbering. The psychological impact of these visual transformations extended far beyond personal vanity to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of imperial authority and divine legitimacy. Citizens who glimpsed their emperor during public appearances were confronted with an image that challenged basic assumptions about leadership, power, and appropriate masculine behavior. Some found themselves inspired by this artistic vision of imperial authority, while others reacted with confusion or barely concealed disgust at what they perceived as abandonment of traditional Roman values. The afternoon hours of Nero's daily schedule had become completely dedicated to artistic pursuits that consumed his attention with an intensity that previous emperors had reserved for military campaigns and administrative oversight. Private rehearsal sessions in specially constructed performance spaces allowed him to experiment with musical compositions and dramatic interpretations away from the critical observation of conservative courtiers who still hoped to moderate his cultural enthusiasms. These rehearsal spaces represented marvels of engineering and artistic design that demonstrated the emperor's commitment to achieving professional-level performance capabilities. Acoustic engineers had modified existing palace chambers to create optimal sound environments for different types of musical and theatrical presentation. Hidden mechanical devices could alter the spaces during performances, creating dramatic effects through changing lighting, moving scenery, and atmospheric enhancements that blurred the boundaries between reality and artistic illusion. The emperor's practice sessions were attended by carefully selected audiences of cultural advisors, professional performers, and artistic critics whose responses were analyzed with the intensity of military intelligence assessments. every aspect of vocal technique, instrumental performance, and dramatic interpretation was scrutinized and refined through repetitive rehearsal, guided by experts who had been imported from the premier cultural centers of the ancient world. Nero's dedication to these artistic pursuits revealed intellectual capabilities and creative sensitivities that might have produced genuine cultural achievements under different circumstances. His musical compositions, while derivative of established Greek models, demonstrated technical competence and emotional sophistication that impressed even skeptical professional musicians. His dramatic interpretations of classical texts showed understanding of character psychology and narrative structure that reflected serious study and natural talent for performance. But the emperor's artistic activities were occurring within a political and social context that made them inherently problematic, regardless of their aesthetic merit. Roman cultural traditions held that public performance was appropriate only for slaves, freedmen, and social outcasts who had no choice but to debase themselves for survival and entertainment. For the divine emperor to engage in such activities violated fundamental assumptions about dignity, authority, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. The evening entertainments that Nero hosted during this period pushed these cultural boundaries even further through elaborate productions that combined dining, performance, and social interaction in ways that scandalized traditional Roman sensibilities. These gatherings were carefully planned events that required weeks of preparation and involved dozens of professional performers, technical specialists, and service personnel who created theatrical environments within the palace complex. The guest lists for these evening events reflected the emperor's transformed priorities and values through the inclusion of individuals who would never have been invited to traditional imperial entertainments. Greek philosophers, Syrian musicians, Egyptian dancers, and artists from across the Mediterranean found themselves dining alongside Roman senators and military commanders in social arrangements that challenged established hierarchies and conventional protocols. The physical settings for these entertainments were designed according to aesthetic principles borrowed from Hellenistic court culture and Eastern royal traditions that emphasized sensory richness and theatrical spectacle over Roman ideals of dignified restraint. Elaborate lighting effects created through strategically placed oil lamps and polished metal reflectors transformed dining spaces into stages where every conversation and interaction became part of a larger artistic presentation. The entertainment itself often featured performances by the emperor, as Nero used these private gatherings to test new material and refine his artistic techniques before larger audiences. These command performances created psychological pressures for guests who understood that their continued access to imperial favor depended partly on their ability to provide appropriate responses to their host's creative efforts. The emperor's performances during these intimate gatherings revealed the full extent of his artistic ambitions and cultural transformation. He would present musical compositions that drew upon traditions from across the known world, combining Roman martial themes with Greek lyrical sophistication and Eastern melodic complexity. His dramatic recitations included adaptations of classical texts, modified to emphasize themes and interpretations that reflected his personal vision of imperial authority and divine creativity. These evening performances also provided opportunities for cultural experimentation that pushed against the boundaries of Roman social convention and religious tradition. Nero's fascination with Greek cultural practices extended to aspects of Hellenistic lifestyle that conservative Romans found deeply troubling, including attitudes towards sexuality, religious observance, and social hierarchy that challenged fundamental assumptions about proper conduct and imperial dignity. The servants and slaves who attended these evening entertainments witnessed behaviors and conversations that would have been scandalous in any other Roman household, but which took on different meanings when performed by someone who believed himself to be a living god. The traditional boundaries between public and private behavior, between sacred and secular activity, between acceptable and transgressive conduct, became increasingly blurred as Nero explored the full range of experiences he believed necessary for his cultural development and artistic inspiration. The palace staff who maintained these elaborate entertainment spaces developed an intimate understanding of their master's evolving personality and priorities through daily exposure to his artistic activities and cultural experiments. They observed the genuine joy and satisfaction that Nero derived from successful performances, but also witnessed the frustration and anger that erupted when technical difficulties or audience reactions failed to meet his expectations. The emperor's relationship with his artistic advisors during this period revealed aspects of his character that had been hidden beneath the ceremonial formality of traditional imperial interactions. When discussing musical theory or dramatic interpretation, Nero displayed intellectual curiosity and collaborative spirit that contrasted sharply with the imperious authority he maintained during governmental meetings. These cultural conversations allowed glimpses of the person he might have become under different circumstances, free from the psychological pressures and political responsibilities that came with absolute power. His sleeping quarters had been transformed into a private artistic sanctuary where the emperor could retreat from the demands of public performance and governmental responsibility. The room's decorations emphasized themes from Greek mythology and Eastern artistic traditions rather than Roman military history, creating an environment that suggested creative inspiration rather than imperial authority. Musical instruments, artistic implements, and collections of scrolls containing poetry and dramatic texts replaced the traditional symbols of Roman power that had surrounded previous emperors. The emperor's bedtime routine increasingly included consultations with trusted advisors about artistic projects and cultural initiatives that had no direct connection to governmental administration. These midnight conversations revealed an imperial psyche completely absorbed in creative pursuits and aesthetic considerations that seemed to exist in a separate realm from the practical challenges of governing a vast empire. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little respite from the artistic obsessions that dominated Nero's waking hours. His dreams were filled with visions of theatrical triumph and musical achievement, mixed with anxieties about critical reception and public approval. The young man, who had once found security in traditional structures of imperial authority, was now creating his own standards of success and failure based on aesthetic criteria that few Romans understood or appreciated. The winter nights brought their own rhythms to palace life as the emperor's artistic activities extended deeper into the hours traditionally reserved for rest and private reflection. The palace complex took on an almost nocturnal character as performance spaces remained active long after conventional bedtime, filled with the sounds of music, poetry, and dramatic rehearsal that echoed through marble corridors and sleeping chambers. These late-night artistic sessions attracted participants from across the Mediterranean world as news of Nero's cultural interests drew musicians, poets, and performers to Rome in search of imperial patronage and artistic opportunity. The palace became a magnet for creative talent that might otherwise have remained scattered across provincial cities and client kingdoms, concentrating aesthetic expertise and cultural innovation within the heart of Roman governmental power. The emperor's nocturnal artistic activities created security challenges for the imperial guard, who found themselves protecting not just a political leader, but an artistic performer whose activities attracted crowds of enthusiastic supporters and curious observers. The traditional protocols for palace security had to be modified to accommodate the irregular schedules and unconventional gatherings that characterized Nero's cultural pursuits. The Praetorian Guard, elite soldiers selected for their loyalty and military competence, found themselves assigned to protect theatrical rehearsals and musical performances that bore no resemblance to the governmental functions they had been trained to secure. These experienced warriors struggled to adapt their protective procedures to environments where the primary threats might come from over-enthusiastic artistic admirers rather than political assassins or military enemies. The psychological impact of these duty assignments on the Imperial Guard created subtle but significant changes in palace atmosphere and security culture. Soldiers accustomed to the dignified formality of traditional imperial protocol found themselves witnessing behaviors and activities that challenged their understanding of appropriate imperial conduct. Some adapted to these new circumstances with professional flexibility, while others developed private reservations about their ruler's priorities and judgment. The dawn hours often found the emperor still engaged in artistic activities that had begun the previous evening, creating irregular sleep patterns that affected his availability for traditional governmental responsibilities. Morning audiences might be delayed or cancelled entirely when Nero's creative sessions extended beyond conventional bedtime, forcing administrative business to accommodate artistic schedules rather than practical necessity. These scheduling disruptions created cascading effects throughout the Roman governmental system as urgent matters requiring imperial attention were postponed to accommodate the emperor's cultural pursuits. Military dispatches that might have influenced the outcome of distant campaigns arrived at the palace only to wait for imperial review, while Nero completed musical compositions or perfected dramatic interpretations that seemed irrelevant to the practical business of imperial administration. The spring of 56 CE brought intensification of these artistic obsessions as Nero began planning his first public performances before audiences beyond the carefully selected guests who attended his private palace entertainments. The prospect of their divine emperor appearing on the stage like a common actor sent shockwaves through Roman society and created the first serious organized opposition to his cultural revolution. The emperor's announcement of his intention to perform publicly at upcoming religious festivals and civic celebrations triggered immediate protests from senators, religious authorities, and conservative aristocrats who viewed such activities as violations of fundamental principles about imperial dignity and divine authority. These objections were expressed through formal petitions, private conferences, and subtle forms of resistance that tested Nero's commitment to his artistic vision against traditional expectations about appropriate imperial behavior. The opposition to his planned public performances revealed the depth of cultural conflict that Nero's artistic pursuits had created within Roman society. Traditional aristocrats who had built their identities around military service and governmental administration found their fundamental assumptions about leadership and authority challenged by an emperor who seemed to value theatrical skill over martial prowess and aesthetic sensitivity over administrative competence. Religious authorities expressed particular concern about the implications of imperial theatrical performance for traditional Roman concepts of divine authority and sacred dignity. The emperor's role as Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious official in Roman society, seemed incompatible with public entertainment activities that were associated with social outcasts and moral degeneracy in conservative religious thinking. The military leadership, while maintaining public loyalty to their commander-in-chief, privately expressed reservations about the impact of Nero's cultural activities on military morale and foreign perceptions of Roman strength. Experienced generals who had spent their careers building respect for Roman military might worry that their emperor's theatrical interests would be interpreted as weakness by barbarian enemies and rebellious provincial populations. These various forms of opposition created the first serious challenge to Nero's authority since his accession to imperial power, forcing him to choose between moderating his artistic pursuits to maintain political stability or asserting his divine right to pursue cultural activities regardless of traditional objections and social consequences. The decision he made would determine not just the immediate trajectory of his reign, but the ultimate fate of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the future direction of Roman civilization. The emperor's response to this opposition revealed the extent to which his personality and priorities had been transformed by his immersion in artistic culture and aesthetic philosophy. Instead of the political compromise and diplomatic flexibility that might have preserved traditional alliances while allowing gradual cultural change, Nero chose direct confrontation with conservative forces that threatened his artistic vision and cultural revolution. His defiance of traditional expectations about imperial behavior escalated the conflict between innovation and tradition into a fundamental crisis about the nature of legitimate authority and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. The teenage emperor, who had once practiced his lyre in secret, was now preparing to challenge the basic assumptions that had governed Roman society for centuries, regardless of the personal and political costs such a confrontation might entail. The stage was set for a collision between artistic vision and political reality, that would test every aspect of Nero's character and capabilities, while determining whether the Roman Empire could accommodate revolutionary changes in imperial culture and governmental priorities. The outcome of this confrontation would echo through history, establishing precedents and creating consequences that would influence the development of Western civilization for millennia to come. The palace complex itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation and tension as servants, courtiers, and officials waited to see how their emperor would navigate the treacherous waters between personal desire and political necessity. The daily routines that had provided structure and predictability to imperial life were about to be tested by forces that threatened to reshape not just individual relationships, but the entire framework of Roman society and governmental authority. The morning of April 19th, 56 CE, dawned grey and overcast, as if the gods themselves were withholding their blessing from what was about to unfold in the marble halls of imperial power. Nero awoke not in his usual chambers, but in a hastily prepared temporary quarters deep within the palace complex, surrounded by bodyguards whose loyalty had been tested through gold rather than tradition. The events of the previous evening had shattered whatever remained of the careful balance between imperial authority and family influence that had sustained the early years of his reign. Agrippina lay dead in her villa across the bay at Baiae, victim of an assassination plot so elaborate and carefully orchestrated that it revealed depths of planning and ruthlessness that few had suspected their artistic emperor possessed. The murder of his mother marked a point of no return in Nero's transformation from reluctant ruler to absolute autocrat. The young man who had once sought maternal guidance for even minor decisions had eliminated the most powerful woman in the Roman world with the same methodical precision he applied to perfecting musical compositions. The psychological barriers that had constrained his behavior were now permanently removed, replaced by a terrifying sense of limitless possibility and divine immunity from moral consequence. His morning routine on this fateful day began with reports from the centurions who had carried out the assassination, their matter-of-fact descriptions of Agrippina's final moments delivered in the same tone they might have used to describe routine military operations. Nero listened to these accounts while his personal slaves prepared his bath, the warm scented water seeming to wash away whatever remained of filial obligation or maternal influence from his consciousness. The emperor's bathing ritual had evolved into an elaborate ceremony that reflected his growing belief in his own divine nature. Precious oils imported from Arabia and India were massaged into his skin by slaves trained in techniques borrowed from Egyptian temple practices. The water itself was heated to precise temperatures and infused with flower petals and aromatic herbs that created an almost mystical atmosphere within the marble chambers. As steam rose around him in fragrant clouds, Nero contemplated the new reality he had created through matricide. No longer would anyone dare question his artistic pursuits or suggest limitations on his cultural experiments. The last voice capable of challenging his divine authority had been permanently silenced, leaving him free to reshape Roman civilization according to his personal vision without interference from traditional constraints or family obligations. The servants who attended his morning preparations moved with even greater deference than usual, their heightened awareness of imperial danger creating an atmosphere of almost religious reverence around their master's daily routine. Every gesture was performed with ceremonial precision, every word spoken in hushed tones that acknowledged the sacred nature of serving someone who had transcended ordinary human limitations through the exercise of absolute power. His wardrobe selection for this momentous day emphasized the artistic identity he was now free to embrace without compromise or apology. Flowing silk robes dyed in shades of purple that captured and reflected light, like liquid amethyst, replaced the traditional toga that had symbolized his connection to Roman governmental tradition. Golden jewelry, crafted by the finest artisans in the empire, adorned his neck, wrists, and fingers. Each piece, selected not merely for its material value, but for its contribution to the overall aesthetic effect of divine majesty. The emperor's grooming routine reached new levels of elaborate sophistication as cosmetic specialists applied pigments and preparations that enhanced his natural features, while creating an almost supernatural aura of beauty and authority. His hair, now grown to shoulder length in defiance of traditional Roman masculine fashion, was arranged in complex patterns that required hours of careful styling, with heated implements and scented waxes imported from the luxury markets of Alexandria and Damascus. The mirror that reflected his transformed appearance showed a figure that bore little resemblance to the uncertain teenager who had first assumed imperial power less than 2 years earlier. The face that gazed back at him possessed the confidence of someone who had tested the limits of absolute authority and found them satisfyingly expansive. The eyes that had once sought approval and guidance now held the steady gaze of a man who recognized no higher authority than his own divine will. His breakfast was served in chambers specially prepared for the occasion, with every detail designed to emphasize the celebratory nature of his newfound freedom from maternal oversight. Exotic delicacies from across the Mediterranean were arranged on golden plates with artistic precision that transformed the meal into a visual feast as well as a culinary experience. Musicians, hidden behind decorative screens, provided atmospheric accompaniment that turned the simple act of dining into a performance worthy of the gods. The morning audiences that followed revealed the immediate impact of Agrippina's death on palace power dynamics and governmental operations. Senators and administrators who had previously approached imperial meetings with carefully prepared presentations about practical matters now found themselves navigating an entirely transformed political landscape, where traditional considerations of policy and administration seemed suddenly irrelevant. Nero's responses to routine governmental business on this day demonstrated the psychological liberation that matricide had provided. Where he had previously shown at least perfunctory interest in military reports and provincial dispatches, he now displayed complete indifference to anything that did not directly relate to his artistic pursuits or personal entertainment. Urgent messages about barbarian incursions were set aside while he discussed plans for new theatrical productions with his cultural advisors. The emperor's physical bearing during these morning meetings revealed the intoxicating effects of unlimited power, exercised without moral constraint. His movements possessed a fluid grace that suggested complete comfort with his divine status, while his voice carried new tones of absolute authority that made even experienced senators hesitate before expressing opinions or raising concerns about imperial policies. The palace atmosphere itself seemed changed by the removal of Agrippina's influence, as if her death had lifted some invisible weight that had constrained the full expression of imperial will and artistic vision. Servants moved through corridors with lighter steps, no longer burdened by the need to navigate between competing sources of authority within the imperial household. Courtiers who had previously calculated their behavior according to complex assessments of family dynamics could now focus their attention entirely on pleasing a single master whose preferences were becoming increasingly clear. The afternoon hours brought the first public test of Nero's new freedom, as he appeared before crowds gathered in the palace courtyard for a scheduled address about recent governmental initiatives. The speech he delivered bore no resemblance to the carefully crafted political presentations that had characterized his previous public appearances. Instead, he spoke extemporaneously about his artistic vision for Roman civilization and his plans to elevate imperial culture to heights worthy of divine inspiration. The audience's reaction to this unprecedented display of imperial self-revelation provided immediate feedback about the broader social implications of Agrippina's elimination. Some citizens responded with enthusiasm to their emperor's passionate description of cultural projects and artistic initiatives that would transform Rome into a center of aesthetic achievement, rivaling the greatest cities of the ancient world. Others listened with obvious confusion or barely concealed alarm at presentations that seemed to have no connection to their practical concerns about taxation, military security, or economic prosperity. The emperor's delivery of this impromptu cultural manifesto revealed performance skills that had been developing through years of private rehearsal and professional instruction. His voice projected clearly across the crowded courtyard, while his gestures emphasized key points with theatrical effectiveness that held audience attention, even when his content challenged their expectations about appropriate imperial communication. The physical staging of this public appearance reflected careful attention to aesthetic details that transformed routine governmental communication into artistic performance. The emperor's position on elevated steps created visual drama, while acoustic properties of the courtyard enhanced the musical qualities of his oratory. Even the timing of the presentation was calculated to take advantage of afternoon lighting that created dramatic shadows and highlights around the imperial figure. The immediate aftermath of this public appearance generated intense discussion throughout Rome as citizens attempted to understand the implications of their emperor's transformed priorities and communication style. Market conversations, tavern debates, and household discussions all focused on the same fundamental question: what did it mean to have a ruler whose primary interests seemed to lie in areas completely outside traditional governmental responsibilities? The emperor's evening routine on this day of liberation brought the full flowering of his artistic interests through an elaborate private performance staged in specially prepared palace chambers. Professional musicians, dancers, and theatrical performers who had been summoned from across the Mediterranean created an entertainment worthy of Eastern potentates, while Nero himself served as both host and featured performer. The performance space had been transformed through mechanical innovations that allowed rapid changes in scenery, lighting, and atmospheric effects during the course of the evening's entertainment. Hidden devices could release flower petals, change the apparent height of ceilings, and create acoustic effects that enhanced musical presentations while maintaining the illusion of supernatural intervention in mortal festivities. Nero's personal performances during this celebratory evening revealed the full extent of his artistic development and cultural ambitions. His musical compositions drew upon traditions from across the known world, while incorporating innovative elements that reflected his unique position as both political ruler and creative artist. His dramatic presentations included adaptations of classical texts, modified to emphasize themes of divine authority and artistic transcendence that reflected his evolving self-image. The guest list for this evening's entertainment included individuals who would never have been welcomed at traditional imperial gatherings, but who possessed the cultural sophistication and artistic expertise that Nero now valued above conventional political credentials. Greek philosophers, Syrian musicians, Egyptian dancers, and artists from across the Mediterranean mingled with Roman senators and military commanders in social arrangements that challenged established hierarchies. The conversations that developed during this evening's entertainment revealed the intellectual stimulation that Nero derived from surrounding himself with individuals who shared his cultural interests and aesthetic sensibilities. Discussions of poetic meter, musical theory, and dramatic interpretation provided the emperor with intellectual challenges and creative inspiration that he found completely absent from routine governmental meetings about taxation, military logistics, and administrative procedures. The psychological atmosphere of liberation that characterized this evening's festivities was palpable to everyone present, as participants recognized that they were witnessing the emergence of an entirely new form of imperial authority based on cultural achievement rather than military conquest or administrative competence. The traditional symbols of Roman power were still present in the background, but they seemed almost irrelevant compared to the immediate reality of artistic performance and aesthetic appreciation. The emperor's behavior during these evening entertainments demonstrated the profound changes that matricide had wrought in his personality and self-perception. Free from maternal criticism and traditional constraints, he displayed levels of creative confidence and artistic ambition that would have been impossible under previous circumstances. His performances possessed emotional depth and technical sophistication that reflected years of serious study, combined with natural talent for musical and dramatic expression. The servants and slaves who maintained these elaborate evening entertainments observed their master's complete transformation from reluctant political ruler to enthusiastic artistic performer. They witnessed the genuine joy and satisfaction that Nero derived from successful creative presentations, but also noted the increasing intensity of his reactions when technical difficulties or audience responses failed to meet his elevated expectations. The palace complex during these evening hours took on characteristics of an artistic academy or cultural centre rather than the governmental headquarters of a vast empire. Performance spaces remained active long after conventional bedtime, while rehearsal chambers echoed with music and poetry that had no connection to traditional imperial business. The normal rhythms of political administration were completely subordinated to the irregular schedules and creative demands of artistic activity. The emperor's sleeping quarters had been further modified to accommodate his evolving artistic interests and transformed self-image. The traditional symbols of Roman military authority were completely replaced by collections of musical instruments, theatrical implements, and artistic materials that spoke to cultural achievement rather than political power. The decorative themes emphasized Greek mythology and Eastern artistic traditions that celebrated creativity and aesthetic refinement over martial conquest and administrative efficiency. His bedtime routine increasingly included extended consultations with artistic advisors about cultural projects and creative initiatives that consumed his attention with an intensity that previous emperors had reserved for military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations. These midnight conversations revealed an imperial psyche completely absorbed in aesthetic considerations that seemed to exist in a separate realm from the practical challenges of governing a vast and complex empire. The dreams that visited Nero during his first night of complete freedom from maternal oversight were filled with visions of artistic triumph and cultural achievement that reflected his transformed priorities and unlimited ambitions. He saw himself performing before audiences of thousands while receiving acclaim that transcended ordinary human appreciation to approach divine worship. These nocturnal fantasies provided glimpses of the destiny he now believed himself capable of achieving through the exercise of absolute power, unconstrained by traditional limitations or moral considerations. The dawn of April 20th found the emperor awakening to a world completely reshaped by his own actions and choices. The palace complex bustled with activity as servants and officials adapted to new routines and priorities that reflected the elimination of competing sources of authority within the imperial household. The careful balance of influences and interests that had characterized the early years of his reign was permanently destroyed, replaced by a more direct and potentially dangerous form of autocratic rule. The morning routine that began this new phase of imperial history included detailed reports about public reaction to the previous day's announcements and performances. Citizens throughout Rome were still processing the implications of their emperor's transformed public persona, while attempting to understand what these changes might mean for their own lives and prospects. The reports that reached imperial chambers revealed a population divided between enthusiasm for cultural innovation and anxiety about the abandonment of traditional governmental priorities. Nero's response to these mixed public reactions demonstrated the confidence and determination that matricide had instilled in his character. Rather than moderating his artistic pursuits to accommodate conservative concerns or traditional expectations, he announced plans for even more ambitious cultural projects that would demonstrate the superiority of aesthetic achievement over conventional political accomplishments. The emperor's breakfast conversation with his remaining advisors revealed the extent to which governmental priorities were being revolutionized according to artistic criteria and cultural considerations. Military campaigns were evaluated primarily for their potential to provide dramatic material for future theatrical presentations. Architectural projects were assessed according to their contribution to Rome's cultural prestige rather than their practical utility for urban administration. Even taxation policies were discussed in terms of their ability to fund artistic initiatives rather than their impact on economic development or military preparedness. The morning audiences that followed breakfast provided immediate evidence of how Agrippina's death was reshaping the entire structure of imperial administration and governmental decision-making. Senators who had previously focused their presentations on practical policy matters now found themselves competing for attention with artists and cultural advisors whose expertise had become suddenly relevant to imperial priorities and resource allocation. The emperor's responses to various governmental matters during these morning meetings revealed the complete transformation of his approach to imperial responsibility and administrative oversight. Traditional concerns about military readiness, economic stability, and provincial administration were dismissed as tedious distractions from the more important work of cultural development and artistic achievement that would define his legacy and justify his divine authority. The physical modifications being implemented throughout the palace complex during this period reflected the permanent nature of the changes that Nero was making to imperial culture and governmental operations. Traditional reception halls were being converted into performance spaces, while administrative offices were relocated to make room for expanded artistic workshops and rehearsal chambers. The very architecture of imperial power was being reshaped according to aesthetic principles rather than practical administrative requirements. The afternoon hours brought the first formal test of Nero's new artistic freedom, as he announced his intention to present a public musical performance at the upcoming Juvenalia festival. This decision represented the complete abandonment of traditional restrictions on imperial behavior, while demonstrating his commitment to revolutionary changes in the relationship between ruler and subjects. The announcement of his planned public performance sent shockwaves throughout Roman society as citizens attempted to comprehend the implications of having their divine emperor appear on stage like a common entertainer. Conservative aristocrats, religious authorities, and military commanders expressed private alarm at this unprecedented violation of imperial dignity, while younger Romans and cultural enthusiasts responded with excitement about the artistic possibilities such performances might provide. The emperor's preparation for this momentous public appearance consumed his attention completely as he worked with professional instructors to perfect every aspect of his planned presentation. Voice coaches provided technical guidance, while theatrical advisors helped develop stage presence and dramatic interpretation skills. Musical instruments were specially crafted to enhance his performance capabilities, while costumes were designed to create visual effects worthy of divine presentation. The psychological intensity of these preparations revealed the extent to which public artistic performance had become central to Nero's identity and self-worth. The young man who had once sought approval through traditional political achievements now staked his entire sense of personal value on aesthetic accomplishment and cultural recognition that had no precedent in Roman imperial history. The evening rehearsals that preceded his public debut created an atmosphere of anticipation and tension that affected everyone involved in the elaborate preparations. Professional performers who had been recruited to support the emperor's presentation found themselves participating in an event that challenged every assumption about the proper relationship between political authority and artistic expression. The palace complex during these final preparation days resembled a theatrical production centre, more than the administrative headquarters of a vast empire. Costume workshops, musical rehearsal spaces, and technical preparation areas consumed rooms that had previously served governmental functions, while armies of specialists worked to ensure that every detail of the imperial performance would meet the highest professional standards. The emperor's sleeping patterns during this period reflected the nervous excitement and artistic ambition that consumed his thoughts as the moment of public presentation approached. His dreams were filled with visions of triumphant reception and artistic acclaim, mixed with anxieties about critical judgment and potential failure that revealed the psychological vulnerabilities underlying his confident public persona. The dawn of the performance day brought culmination of months of artistic development and cultural revolution as Nero prepared to present himself before Roman audiences, not as a traditional political ruler, but as a creative artist seeking appreciation and approval for aesthetic achievement rather than governmental competence or military success. The morning routine that preceded this historic presentation included elaborate rituals of preparation that transformed the emperor's usual grooming and dressing procedures into something approaching religious ceremony. Every aspect of his appearance was carefully crafted to create visual impact, while his voice was prepared through exercises designed to ensure optimal performance capabilities under the stress of public presentation. The palace atmosphere on this momentous day vibrated with anticipation and tension, as everyone involved in the preparations understood that they were participating in an event that would fundamentally alter the relationship between imperial authority and Roman society. The outcome of this unprecedented public performance would determine not just the immediate trajectory of Nero's reign, but the future direction of imperial culture and governmental priorities. The emperor's final preparations included private moments of reflection and artistic focus that revealed the depth of his commitment to this revolutionary transformation of imperial identity and public presentation. Standing before mirrors that reflected his carefully crafted appearance, Nero saw not the uncertain teenager who had inherited power through family manipulation, but a confident artist prepared to demonstrate the divine nature of creative achievement and aesthetic excellence. The journey from palace to performance venue became itself a form of theatrical presentation as crowds gathered along the route to witness their emperor's unprecedented public appearance. The procession that carried Nero to his artistic debut included all the ceremonial elements of traditional imperial pageantry, while incorporating new visual elements that emphasized cultural achievement over military conquest. The moment had arrived when theory would meet reality, when months of private preparation and artistic development would face the ultimate test of public reception and critical judgment. The teenage emperor, who had begun his reign seeking to balance traditional expectations with personal interests, was about to discover whether Roman society could accommodate revolutionary changes in the fundamental nature of imperial authority and governmental purpose. The amphitheatre fell silent as Nero stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, his silk robes catching the breeze like the wings of some exotic bird. The crowd of 30,000 Romans had never seen anything like this. Their emperor, the divine ruler of the known world, stood before them not in military dress or ceremonial toga, but in the flowing garments of a Greek performer, a golden lyre cradled in his arms like a sacred offering. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Senators in their reserved seats shifted uncomfortably, their faces masks of barely controlled horror. Military commanders stared in disbelief at their supreme general transformed into something they could barely comprehend. But in the common seats, where merchants and artisans and freedmen pressed together in anticipation, a different energy was building. Nero raised the lyre, his fingers finding the strings with the practiced ease of years of secret preparation. The first notes drifted across the vast space, clear and pure, carrying a melody that spoke of longing and divine inspiration. His voice, trained by the finest masters money could command, rose to meet the music with words adapted from Virgil, but transformed into something entirely his own. The song told of Troy's fall and Aeneas's journey, but in Nero's interpretation, it became a meditation on destiny and divine purpose, on the loneliness of godhood and the price of absolute power. His performance technique was flawless, his emotional interpretation sophisticated beyond anything most Romans had ever witnessed. For nearly an hour, he held 30,000 people in complete silence, his voice soaring through passages that demanded extraordinary vocal control, while his fingers drew music from the golden strings that seemed to capture sunlight itself. When the final note faded into silence, the reaction was unlike anything in Roman history. The common people erupted in wild applause, their cheers echoing off the marble walls like thunder. They had witnessed their god revealing his divine nature through artistic expression, and they responded with religious fervor that bordered on hysteria. But the senators sat frozen, their faces reflecting the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. and its implications for everything they understood about Roman civilization. Nero stood in the center of this chaos, drinking in the adulation like wine. The teenage emperor, who had once practiced in secret, had just shattered every convention of imperial behavior, and the intoxication of that moment was more powerful than any drug. He had proven that divine authority could manifest itself through beauty as well as conquest, through creativity as well as destruction. The return journey to the palace became a triumph, unlike any military procession in Roman memory. Citizens lined the streets throwing flower petals and calling out praise for their emperor's artistic gifts. Nero rode through this celebration in an open chariot, acknowledging the crowds with gestures borrowed from theatrical tradition, his face radiant with the satisfaction of artistic achievement and public recognition. But even as the crowds cheered, darker currents were already flowing beneath the surface of this apparent triumph. In the private dining rooms of aristocratic mansions, senators who had witnessed the performance gathered to discuss its implications in hushed tones. The whispered conversations that began that evening would eventually grow into the conspiracies that would define the remainder of Nero's reign. The emperor's evening routine on this day of artistic triumph revealed the complete transformation that public performance had wrought in his personality and priorities. The traditional imperial banquet was replaced by an elaborate cultural celebration where professional artists from across the Mediterranean gathered to honor their imperial colleague. The conversations that filled the palace halls focused entirely on aesthetic theory and artistic technique, rather than the practical matters of governance that had once dominated imperial entertaining. Nero's behavior during this victory celebration demonstrated the profound psychological satisfaction he derived from artistic recognition and cultural achievement. His interactions with guests possessed an energy and enthusiasm that had been completely absent during traditional governmental meetings. When discussing his performance with fellow musicians, his face lit up with genuine passion, while his voice carried tones of excitement that revealed the depth of his artistic commitment. The palace servants who attended this evening's festivities observed their master's complete emotional transformation from the uncertain ruler who had struggled with traditional expectations to the confident artist who had discovered his true calling. They witnessed conversations about musical theory that continued past midnight, discussions of poetic meter that consumed hours of imperial attention, and planning sessions for future performances that revealed ambitions far beyond anything previously imagined. The emperor's sleeping chambers that night were filled with the instruments and artistic materials that had become the true symbols of his authority. The golden lyre that had carried his voice to 30,000 listeners rested beside his bed like a sacred relic, while scrolls containing musical compositions and dramatic adaptations covered tables that had once held military dispatches and administrative reports. His dreams during this first night of complete artistic liberation were filled with visions of even greater performances and more ambitious cultural projects. He saw himself founding festivals that would rival the Olympic Games, constructing theatres that would dwarf the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world, and creating artistic works that would ensure his immortality through aesthetic rather than military accomplishment. The morning after his theatrical debut brought reports from across the empire about reactions to news of the emperor's unprecedented public performance. Provincial governors struggled to explain to their populations why their divine ruler had appeared on stage like a common entertainer, while military commanders dealt with questions from their troops about the implications of imperial artistic pursuits for Roman military traditions. Nero's response to these mixed reactions revealed the extent to which his successful performance had strengthened his confidence in his chosen path. Rather than moderating his artistic activities to accommodate traditional concerns, he announced plans for expanded cultural programming that would transform Rome into the artistic capital of the world. The applause of 30,000 citizens had convinced him that his divine nature was better expressed through creative achievement than through conventional imperial duties. The morning audiences that resumed after his performance breakthrough demonstrated how completely governmental priorities had been revolutionized according to artistic criteria. Military reports were reviewed primarily for their dramatic potential rather than their strategic implications. Economic proposals were evaluated based on their ability to fund cultural projects rather than their impact on imperial revenues. Even diplomatic correspondence was assessed according to its literary merit rather than its political significance. The emperor's daily schedule during this period reflected the complete prioritization of artistic pursuits over traditional governmental responsibilities. Morning voice lessons took precedence over military briefings. Afternoon rehearsals consumed time that had previously been devoted to administrative oversight. Evening cultural gatherings replaced the formal diplomatic receptions that had once maintained Rome's complex web of international relationships. The physical transformation of the palace complex accelerated dramatically as Nero ordered the conversion of governmental offices into artistic workshops and performance spaces. The throne room itself was modified to improve acoustic properties for musical presentations, while traditional reception halls were redesigned to accommodate theatrical productions. The very architecture of imperial power was being reshaped to serve aesthetic rather than administrative purposes. The emperor's personal routine reflected his complete identification with artistic rather than political identity. His morning preparations emphasized theatrical presentation techniques rather than imperial dignity. His clothing choices prioritized visual impact over traditional Roman masculine authority. His daily conversations focused on creative projects rather than the practical challenges of governing a vast and complex empire. The servants who maintained the emperor's transformed living spaces observed the depth of his commitment to this artistic revolution through countless small details that revealed changed priorities and values. Musical instruments received more careful attention than military equipment. Artistic materials were treated with greater reverence than governmental documents. Creative consultants enjoyed more intimate access to imperial favor than experienced administrators or military commanders. The psychological atmosphere within the palace during this period was charged with the excitement of revolutionary change, combined with underlying tensions about the abandonment of traditional structures and expectations. Courtiers who had built their careers on conventional political relationships struggled to adapt to new hierarchies based on cultural sophistication rather than governmental competence. The emperor's relationships with his remaining family members during this period reflected the broader tensions between artistic innovation and traditional Roman values. His wife Octavia found herself increasingly marginalized as Nero's attention focused on Greek intellectuals and professional performers who shared his cultural interests. His interactions with senators and military commanders became perfunctory and distracted as he devoted his emotional energy to creative collaborations and artistic projects. The afternoon hours increasingly belonged to elaborate rehearsal sessions where Nero worked with professional instructors to develop new performance capabilities and expand his artistic repertoire. These sessions were conducted with the same intensity and attention to detail that previous emperors had applied to military planning and strategic oversight. Every aspect of vocal technique, instrumental performance, and theatrical presentation was analyzed and perfected through repetitive practice, guided by experts imported from the cultural centers of the Greek world. The emperor's dedication to these artistic pursuits revealed intellectual capabilities and creative sensitivities that might have produced genuine cultural achievements under different circumstances. His musical compositions, while influenced by established Greek models, demonstrated technical competence and emotional sophistication that impressed even skeptical professional musicians. His dramatic interpretations showed understanding of character psychology and narrative structure that reflected serious study and natural talent for performance. But these artistic activities were occurring within a political context that made them inherently problematic, regardless of their aesthetic merit. The time and attention that Nero devoted to cultural pursuits were being diverted from governmental responsibilities that affected millions of lives across the Mediterranean world. Provincial rebellions went unaddressed while he perfected new musical techniques. Military campaigns lacked adequate imperial oversight, while he developed theatrical performance skills. The evening entertainments that followed his successful public debut became increasingly elaborate productions that consumed enormous resources while serving no practical governmental purpose. These gatherings required weeks of preparation and involved hundreds of participants who created theatrical environments within the palace complex that bore no resemblance to traditional imperial hospitality or diplomatic entertaining. The guest lists for these cultural celebrations reflected the emperor's transformed values through the inclusion of individuals who possessed artistic credentials rather than political authority or military experience. Professional performers, cultural critics, and aesthetic theorists found themselves dining with senators and provincial governors in social arrangements that challenged established hierarchies and conventional protocols. The conversations that developed during these evening entertainments revealed the intellectual stimulation that Nero derived from surrounding himself with individuals who shared his cultural interests and aesthetic sensibilities. Discussions of artistic theory, creative technique, and cultural philosophy provided the emperor with mental challenges that he found completely absent from routine governmental meetings about taxation, infrastructure, and military logistics. The physical settings for these entertainments were designed according to principles borrowed from Hellenistic court culture and Eastern royal traditions that emphasized sensory richness and theatrical spectacle over Roman ideals of dignified restraint. Elaborate lighting effects, mechanical devices that could change room configurations during events, and atmospheric enhancements created environments that blurred the boundaries between reality and artistic performance. The emperor's personal performances during these intimate gatherings revealed the full extent of his artistic ambitions and cultural transformation. He presented musical compositions that incorporated influences from across the known world, while his dramatic recitations included adaptations of classical texts, modified to emphasize themes of divine creativity and aesthetic transcendence. The psychological satisfaction that Nero derived from these artistic achievements was obvious to everyone who observed his behavior during cultural activities. His face would light up with genuine enthusiasm when discussing creative projects, while his voice carried tones of excitement and engagement that were completely absent during traditional governmental meetings. The contrast between his animated participation in artistic conversations and his distracted responses to administrative matters revealed where his true interests and emotional investments lay. The servants and slaves who maintained these elaborate cultural productions witnessed the emperor's complete transformation from reluctant political ruler to passionate artistic performer. They observed the genuine joy he derived from successful creative presentations, but also noted the increasing intensity of his reactions when technical difficulties or audience responses failed to meet his elevated expectations. The palace complex during these evening hours took on characteristics that had more in common with a cultural academy or artistic center than the governmental headquarters of the world's most powerful empire. Performance spaces remained active long after conventional bedtime, while rehearsal chambers echoed with music and poetry that served no practical administrative purpose. The emperor's sleeping quarters reflected his complete identification with artistic rather than political identity through decorative themes that emphasized creative achievement over imperial authority. Musical instruments, theatrical implements, and collections of artistic materials replaced the traditional symbols of Roman military power that had surrounded previous emperors. His bedtime routine increasingly included extended consultations with cultural advisors about artistic projects and creative initiatives that consumed his attention with an intensity that previous rulers had reserved for military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations. These midnight conversations revealed an imperial psyche completely absorbed in aesthetic considerations that seemed to exist independently of the practical challenges facing Roman governance. The dreams that visited Nero during this period of artistic triumph were filled with visions of even greater cultural achievements and more ambitious performance projects. He envisioned festivals that would attract artists from across the known world, theatres that would showcase the finest creative talents of his age, and artistic works that would ensure his immortality through aesthetic, rather than military accomplishment. But even as the emperor lost himself in these artistic fantasies, the practical consequences of his transformed priorities were creating problems throughout the Roman governmental system. Military commanders struggled to obtain imperial approval for necessary troop deployments, while provincial governors waited months for responses to urgent administrative requests. The complex machinery of imperial administration was gradually grinding to a halt as its supreme authority focused his attention on cultural pursuits that had no connection to practical governance. The morning of June 15th, 56 CE, brought the first serious crisis that would test whether Nero's artistic government could respond effectively to practical challenges requiring immediate imperial attention and decisive action. Reports arrived from Britain describing a massive coordinated rebellion that threatened to drive Roman forces from the island entirely, while simultaneous dispatches from the Rhine frontier warned of barbarian tribal movements that suggested preparation for major invasions. These military emergencies demanded the kind of focused imperial attention and strategic decision-making that had characterized effective Roman leadership for centuries. But the emperor who received these urgent reports was no longer the same person who had inherited the throne less than 2 years earlier. His response to this developing crisis would reveal whether artistic sensitivity and cultural sophistication could substitute for traditional military leadership and administrative competence. The morning audience where these emergency reports were presented took place in chambers that had been modified to optimize acoustic properties for musical performance rather than facilitate serious governmental discussion. The emperor, who listened to descriptions of military disasters and strategic threats, was dressed in flowing silk robes designed for theatrical presentation rather than the practical garments appropriate for military planning and administrative oversight. Nero's initial response to these urgent military reports demonstrated the extent to which his priorities and attention had been captured by artistic rather than governmental concerns. His first questions focused on whether the British rebellion might provide dramatic material for future theatrical presentations, rather than on the strategic implications of losing Roman control over a major province. The military commanders and administrative officials who had travelled from distant provinces to brief their emperor on these developing crises found themselves competing for attention with music teachers and theatrical advisors whose presence in the imperial council chamber would have been unthinkable under previous rulers. The contrast between the urgency of their practical concerns and the emperor's distracted responses revealed the dangerous gap that had opened between imperial priorities and governmental necessities. The afternoon hours that should have been devoted to intensive strategic planning and military coordination were instead consumed by rehearsal sessions where Nero worked on new musical compositions inspired by classical descriptions of warfare and heroic adventure. The same dramatic themes that demanded immediate practical attention in Britain and Germany became source material for artistic interpretation rather than subjects requiring decisive imperial action. The emperor's evening entertainments during this period of military crisis featured elaborate cultural programming that seemed to exist in a completely separate realm from the practical challenges facing Roman governance. While Roman soldiers fought for their lives against overwhelming enemy forces, their supreme commander hosted poetry readings and musical performances that celebrated aesthetic achievement over martial valor. The psychological disconnect between imperial artistic pursuits and governmental responsibilities became increasingly apparent as news of military disasters competed with cultural projects for the emperor's limited attention and emotional investment. Nero's responses to reports of Roman defeats lacked the urgency and focus that such crises demanded, while his enthusiasm for creative endeavors remained undiminished by practical concerns about imperial survival and governmental effectiveness. The palace atmosphere during this period reflected the surreal quality of an administration that had lost connection with the realities of governing a vast empire facing serious external threats. Artistic workshops continued their elaborate productions, while military dispatches waited for imperial review. Cultural celebrations proceeded according to schedule, while urgent governmental decisions were postponed to accommodate performance rehearsals and creative consultations. The servants and courtiers who observed these daily routines understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented and potentially catastrophic in Roman imperial history. The emperor, who should have been coordinating responses to existential military threats, was instead perfecting his interpretation of tragic monologues and composing musical variations on classical themes. The morning routine that began each day of this developing crisis included detailed reports about artistic projects and cultural initiatives, while military updates were relegated to brief summaries that failed to convey the urgency of deteriorating strategic situations. The emperor's breakfast conversations focused on aesthetic theory and performance technique, while Roman armies struggled without adequate imperial support or strategic guidance. The transformation was complete now, irreversible in its scope and implications for the future of Roman civilization. The teenage emperor, who had once sought to balance traditional expectations with personal interests, had evolved into something entirely unprecedented. A divine ruler whose primary identity was artistic rather than political, whose greatest ambitions were cultural rather than military, and whose daily priorities reflected aesthetic rather than governmental concerns. The consequences of this transformation were already becoming apparent in the mounting crises that threatened Roman security and stability throughout the Mediterranean world. But Nero himself seemed oblivious to these practical implications, completely absorbed in the artistic pursuits that provided him with psychological satisfaction and creative fulfillment that traditional imperial duties had never offered. The stage was set for a collision between aesthetic idealism and political reality that would test every assumption about the nature of effective leadership and governmental responsibility. The emperor, who believed he could rule through artistic inspiration, was about to discover whether cultural achievement could substitute for military competence and administrative effectiveness in maintaining the complex system of power and authority that held the Roman Empire together. The crisis that erupted in the summer of 56 CE revealed the fatal flaw in Nero's artistic revolution. While he composed music in marble chambers, Roman legions faced annihilation on distant frontiers. The dispatches that arrived each dawn painted an increasingly desperate picture of imperial collapse. But the emperor who read them seemed to inhabit a different world entirely. His morning routine now began with vocal exercises conducted in chambers specially designed for acoustic perfection. The same marble walls that had once echoed with strategic planning now resonated with scales and arpeggios as Nero prepared his voice for the day's artistic endeavors. Professional instructors from Athens guided his breathing techniques while outside. Urgent messengers waited with reports of cities burning and armies retreating. The emperor's bath had become an elaborate ritual of artistic preparation. Slaves trained in theatrical makeup techniques applied pigments that enhanced his features for performance, while others massaged his hands with oils designed to maintain the suppleness necessary for complex lyre playing. The water itself was scented with exotic flowers that created an atmosphere more suited to a Greek temple than the administrative center of a military empire. His breakfast was served on golden plates arranged with aesthetic precision. Each dish selected not merely for taste, but for visual appeal. Musicians hidden behind silk screens provided atmospheric accompaniment that transformed the simple act of eating into a performance worthy of divine appreciation. Meanwhile, provincial governors, who had traveled thousands of miles to brief their emperor on rebellions and invasions, waited in antechambers, their urgent reports growing more desperate with each passing hour. The morning audiences that followed revealed the complete transformation of imperial priorities. When military commanders finally gained access to present their crisis reports, they found themselves addressing an emperor whose attention wandered constantly toward artistic considerations. A description of British tribal warfare tactics might prompt Nero to ask whether such dramatic material could be adapted for theatrical presentation, rather than how Roman forces could be reinforced or strategically repositioned. The throne room itself had been modified to serve dual purposes as both governmental centre and performance venue. Acoustic engineers had installed hidden chambers that could amplify the emperor's voice during speeches, while mechanical devices allowed rapid changes in lighting and atmosphere. The traditional symbols of Roman military power were still present, but they seemed almost decorative compared to the musical instruments and artistic implements that now occupied places of honour. Nero's responses to urgent governmental business during this period demonstrated how completely his worldview had been transformed by artistic pursuits. When presented with detailed intelligence about barbarian troop movements, he would inquire about the poetic possibilities of describing such martial scenes rather than analysing their strategic implications. Military logistics became source material for dramatic compositions rather than practical problems requiring immediate imperial attention. The emperor's clothing during these morning meetings emphasized theatrical presentation over traditional imperial dignity. Flowing silk robes that moved gracefully during oratorical gestures had replaced the rigid formal togas that symbolized Roman governmental authority. His jewelry was selected for its contribution to overall visual effect, rather than its traditional symbolic significance, creating an image that suggested artistic inspiration rather than military command. The afternoon hours brought a complete departure from conventional imperial routine as Nero devoted himself entirely to rehearsal and creative development. Private performance spaces within the palace complex became the true centres of imperial activity, while traditional governmental offices stood largely empty except for clerks processing routine administrative matters without meaningful imperial oversight. These rehearsal sessions were elaborate productions that required the participation of dozens of professional artists, technical specialists, and support personnel imported from cultural centres across the Mediterranean. The same level of detailed planning and resource allocation that previous emperors had devoted to military campaigns was now applied to perfecting musical compositions and dramatic interpretations that served no practical governmental purpose. The emperor's dedication to these artistic pursuits was total and unwavering, revealing intellectual capabilities and creative sensitivities that might have produced genuine cultural achievements under different circumstances. His musical technique was developing rapidly under professional instruction, while his understanding of dramatic interpretation showed sophistication that impressed even skeptical artistic advisors who had initially viewed imperial patronage as merely another source of income. But this artistic development was occurring while Roman civilization faced existential threats that demanded immediate attention and decisive action. The same hours that Nero spent perfecting his lyre technique were hours when military commanders needed strategic guidance. Provincial administrators required policy decisions, and diplomatic crises demanded imperial intervention. The palace atmosphere during these afternoon rehearsals was charged with creative energy that seemed to exist in a completely separate realm from the practical world of governmental responsibility. Musicians and poets gathered in chambers decorated with exotic tapestries and filled with the scents of rare incenses, creating environments that suggested Eastern luxury rather than Roman administrative efficiency. The emperor's personal involvement in these artistic activities revealed the psychological satisfaction he derived from creative achievement compared to traditional imperial duties. His face would light up with genuine enthusiasm when discussing musical theory or dramatic interpretation, while his voice carried tones of excitement that were completely absent during governmental meetings about taxation, military logistics, or provincial administration. The servants who attended these rehearsal sessions observed their master's complete transformation from reluctant political ruler to passionate artistic performer. They witnessed the genuine joy that Nero derived from successful creative presentations, but also noted the increasing intensity of his reactions when technical difficulties or performance problems interfered with his artistic vision. The evening entertainments that concluded each day had evolved into elaborate cultural productions that consumed enormous resources while serving no practical governmental purpose. These gatherings required weeks of preparation and involved hundreds of participants who created theatrical environments within the palace complex that bore no resemblance to traditional imperial hospitality or diplomatic entertaining. The guest lists for these evening events reflected the emperor's transformed values through the inclusion of individuals whose only qualifications were artistic talent or cultural sophistication. Professional performers, aesthetic theorists, and creative specialists found themselves dining with senators and military commanders in social arrangements that challenged every established hierarchy and conventional protocol. The physical settings for these entertainments incorporated mechanical innovations that allowed rapid transformation of dining spaces into performance venues. Hidden devices could release flower petals from concealed chambers, change the apparent height of ceilings through clever lighting effects, and create acoustic environments that enhanced musical presentations while maintaining the illusion of supernatural intervention in mortal festivities. Nero's personal performances during these intimate gatherings revealed the full extent of his artistic ambitions and cultural transformation. He would present musical compositions that incorporated influences from across the known world, combining Roman martial themes with Greek lyrical sophistication and Eastern melodic complexity. His dramatic recitations included adaptations of classical texts, modified to emphasize themes of divine creativity and artistic transcendence. The conversations that developed during these evening entertainments provided the emperor with intellectual stimulation that he found completely absent from routine governmental discussions. Debates about aesthetic theory, creative technique, and cultural philosophy engaged his attention with an intensity that administrative meetings about taxation, infrastructure, and military preparedness could never achieve. The psychological atmosphere of these cultural celebrations was one of complete liberation from traditional constraints and expectations. Participants understood that they were witnessing the emergence of an entirely new form of imperial authority based on artistic achievement rather than military conquest or administrative competence. The traditional symbols of Roman power were still present in the background, but they seemed almost irrelevant compared to the immediate reality of creative performance and aesthetic appreciation. The emperor's behavior during these evening gatherings demonstrated the profound changes that artistic pursuits had wrought in his personality and self-perception. Free from traditional governmental responsibilities and conventional expectations about imperial conduct, he displayed levels of creative confidence and cultural ambition that would have been impossible under previous circumstances. The palace complex during these evening hours resembled an artistic academy or cultural centre, more than the governmental headquarters of a vast military empire. Performance spaces remained active long after conventional bedtime, while rehearsal chambers echoed with music and poetry that had no connection to traditional imperial business or practical administrative necessities. The emperor's sleeping quarters had been transformed into a private artistic sanctuary where he could retreat from any remaining demands of public responsibility and governmental oversight. Musical instruments, theatrical implements, and collections of artistic materials replaced the traditional symbols of Roman military authority that had surrounded previous emperors. His bedtime routine increasingly included extended consultations with cultural advisors about artistic projects and creative initiatives that consumed his attention with an intensity that previous rulers had reserved for military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations. These midnight conversations revealed an imperial psyche completely absorbed in aesthetic considerations that seemed to exist independently of the practical challenges facing Roman governance. The dreams that visited Nero during this period were filled with visions of even greater artistic achievements and more ambitious cultural projects. He envisioned festivals that would attract performers from across the known world, theatres that would showcase the finest creative talents of his age, and artistic works that would ensure his immortality through aesthetic rather than military accomplishment. But while the emperor lost himself in these nocturnal fantasies of cultural triumph, the practical consequences of his transformed priorities were creating catastrophic problems throughout the Roman governmental system. Military disasters in Britain and Germany went unaddressed, while provincial rebellions spread unchecked across territories that lacked adequate imperial attention and strategic coordination. The morning routine that began each new day of this developing crisis included elaborate artistic preparations, while urgent military dispatches were relegated to brief summaries that failed to convey the desperateness of deteriorating strategic situations. The emperor's breakfast conversations focused on performance techniques and creative projects, while Roman armies struggled without adequate imperial support or meaningful strategic guidance. The servants who maintained the emperor's transformed living spaces observed the surreal quality of an administration that had lost all connection with the realities of governing a vast empire facing serious external threats. They witnessed daily routines that prioritized aesthetic considerations over practical necessities, creative pursuits over governmental responsibilities, and artistic satisfaction over imperial survival. The morning audiences that resumed after each night of cultural celebration demonstrated the complete disconnect between imperial priorities and administrative requirements. Senators and military commanders found themselves competing for attention with music teachers and theatrical advisors, whose presence in governmental meetings would have been unthinkable under previous rulers. The emperor's responses to urgent business during these morning sessions revealed the extent to which his capacity for practical decision-making had been compromised by his obsession with artistic pursuits. Military emergencies that demanded immediate imperial intervention were treated as potential source material for dramatic compositions, rather than crises requiring strategic analysis and decisive action. The physical transformation of the palace complex accelerated during this period, as traditional governmental offices were converted into artistic workshops and performance spaces. The throne room itself was modified with acoustic enhancements and mechanical devices that prioritized theatrical presentation over administrative functionality, creating an environment more suitable for cultural events than serious governmental deliberation. And so we reach the end of our journey through the marble halls, where madness wore a crown, and art became the mask for empire's decay. The teenage boy who had once practiced his lyre in secret gardens had transformed himself into history's most infamous emperor, proving that absolute power corrupts not through cruelty alone, but through the dangerous freedom to remake the world according to one's personal vision. Nero's daily routines, his morning ablutions and evening entertainments, his artistic obsessions and governmental neglect, all led inexorably to the flames that would consume both his dynasty and his dreams of cultural immortality. The Julio-Claudians had fallen not to barbarian swords or republican conspiracies, but to the simple human truth that power without wisdom, creativity without restraint, and divinity without humanity must always devour itself. As you drift into sleep tonight, remember that even gods must answer for their choices in the end. Sweet dreams, friend.